ولدينا
I'm just going to briefly introduce their names and their papers before we begin the presentations. The first today will be Viacheslav Semenenko, who is presenting on Ukraine warfare in the land and air domains. We also have Hanna Shelest, The Power of Asymmetry, Ukraine's Maritime Strategy as a Model for Small State Naval Defense. Henrik Praks, Small State Defense and Estonian Perspective. And online will be Oleksandr Bogomolov, How Ukraine Defends from Societal Resilience to Integrated Defense. I am your chair for today, Christina Pashtin from Northwestern University in Qatar. Our first panelist, Viacheslav Semenenko. He is a professor at the Military Academy of Ukraine. He graduated from several military institutions, the last of which was the National Defense University of Ukraine, strategic level, in 2017. He obtained his PhD in Technical Sciences in 2012, 081, and his associate professorship in 2015. His main areas of research are national resistance, hybrid war, defense policy, and military strategy, logistic, and armament. He was the co-chair of the international project SAS 161, Military Aspects of Countering Hybrid Warfare, Experiences, Lessons, Best Practices. Thank you, Viacheslav.
Thank you. Dear organizers, dear conference participants, my name is Viacheslav Semenenko. I represent the Military Academy of Ukraine here. Today marks the third anniversary of the Russian Federation's full-scale, illegal, unprovoked military aggressions against sovereign state, against Ukraine. So I appreciate for your support of our country in our struggle against the world's evil, against Russian Federation. The topic of my presentation you can see on this slide. In my presentation, I would like to emphasize 4 points. First, change in the strategy of the modern warfare. Second, offensive operation in Kursk region. Third, defensive operation in Pokrovsk region. And last one, countering full-scale Russian aggression in the air domain. So first question. Commanders and staffs always face the problem of choosing an effective strategy that leads to success in war. Russo-Ukrainian war is based on a combination of the principles of Soviet operational art and the theory of deep operations and the American doctrine of air-land battle. The fundamental problem with military strategy is that the war has become positional. The widespread use of unmanned aerial vehicles, extensive multi-layer defensive fortifications, vast minefields, the approximate parity of opposing forces do not, in themselves, define the positional nature of the war. Instead, this characteristic is determined by the key features of the theater operations, the composition of the opposing forces, the combination of available technologies and tactical approaches, and the number of specific limitations. Failure to understand the nature of the dynamics of modern warfare can result in either defeat or a significant prolongation of the war. The following specific limitations contribute to the positional nature of the Russo-Ukrainian war. You can see on this slide. First, both parties possess sufficient capabilities to maintain a continuous defense along the entire front line without exposed flanks, while also creating adequate tactical depth and reserves in key locations. Second, countering forces in the main operational direction increases risks on secondary fronts. Third, opening new fronts and extending the front line does not yield significant advantages. Next, offensive operations have become so costly that exploding breakthroughs is often impractical. Next, the traditional principle of countering effort in a single direction is no longer an effective solution. Modern warfare efficiency depends on the balance of technological capabilities, material resources, and the integration of new tactical and operational approaches. Next, a system of defensive lines must be established at a certain depth in the rear particularly when fighting an adversary with significant resources. Last, the primary requirement for successful operational planning remains the accurate determination of the depth of the operation. Additionally, planning and preparing for operations is essential, as a single offensive alone cannot achieve the operational objective. As of February 2025, since the onset of Russia's full-scale invasion in February 2022, Russian forces have occupied a total of 68,050 square kilometers of Ukrainian territory. When accounting for the Crimean Peninsula annexed in 2014 and the Donbas territory seized by Russian troops before 2022, Russia currently controls near 18% of Ukraine's total land area. Along the nearly 1,000 kilometers front line, Ukraine's current strategic priorities include operations in Russia's Kursk region and the defense of the Ukrainian city of Pokrovsk. So, first, I describe the offensive operation in Kursk region. 6 months ago, Ukrainian troops entered their Kursk region to prevent an offensive of the Kharkiv and Sumy regions. Russia's overconfidence prevented it from anticipating such an operation. Yet for 6 months, it has been unable to expel Ukrainian troops from Kursk, despite regaining control over part of the previously occupied territory. In an attempt to bolster its forces, Russia sought assistance from North Korea. But this intervention failed to shift the battlefield situation. The main military results of the Kursk operation you can see on this slide. 60,000 Russian troops were redeployed to the Kursk region. Total enemy losses amount to 40,000 personnel, including 16,000 irretrievable losses and more than 1,000 pieces of equipment. Next, more than 800 Russian soldiers were taken prisoner. Their preparations were carried out as secretly as possible. Only 4 Ukrainian officers were involved in the planning of the operation. The officers below were informed to the details of these operations 3 days before the offensive, and the rank and file 1 day before. North Korea has lost up to 40% of its contingent sent to Russia. About 4,000 people killed, wounded, or missing, including up to 1,000 dead, which led to the disorganization and withdrawal of North Korean troops. During the first months of the Kursk operation, the Ukrainian armed forces managed to take control of more Russian territory than Russians had managed in almost a year of offensive in eastern Ukraine. Next, the maximum area controlled by the defense forces in the Kursk region was about 1,376 square kilometers. Important political results of the Kursk operation include the following. First, for the first time in the 11 years of the Russian-Ukrainian war, hostilities took place on the enemy's territory. For the first time since World War II, foreign tanks entered Russian territory. Third, during the first hours of the offensive, more than 50 Russians were captured. 4, 2 North Korean soldiers were captured, which is direct evidence of North Korea's participation in the coalition with Russia in the war. The Kursk operation remains one of the priorities of the Ukrainian army, along with the destruction of military targets deep in Russia. Both sides consider control of Kursk to be a key factor of the extended peace talks. Next. Defensive operation in Pokrovsk. The eastern Ukrainian city of Pokrovsk is situated on flat, open farmland, surrounded by a tight ring of devastated mining villages. The ongoing battle has evolved into a confrontation between Russian infantry and Ukrainian unarmored aerial vehicles, drones. Drones are continuously monitoring the front line, almost completely replacing traditional reconnaissance troops. When Russian soldiers advance towards Ukrainian position, explosive-laden drones are deployed against them. The Ukrainian infantry engaged only when isolated Russian soldiers manage to evade drones' strikes. This tactic has proven highly effective. In nearly a year since Moscow launched its offensive in Pokrovsk, Russian troops have failed to capture the city, despite a huge advantage in manpower and artillery firepower. Neither side deploys large armored vehicles to the front line anymore, as they have become highly vulnerable to drones' attacks. Instead, Russian infantry now try to advance on foot in small groups of 2 or 3 soldiers, making them harder to detect and target by drones. The Russian army continues to advance slowly. Stopping their progress would require a significant influx of Ukrainian troops, which remains unlikely in the near future. While drones can disrupt enemy attacks, they cannot fully replace infantry in defensive operations. Ukraine currently produces approximately 200,000 drones per month. Next fact, during the Russian offensive, they suffer more than 1,000 casualties every day. Sometimes the Russians employ electronic warfare to jam Ukrainian drones. Weather conditions such as rain or fog further limit drone effectiveness, providing opportunities for larger-scale Russian offensive involving armored vehicles. Russia also deploys its own fleet of combat drones, which pose a significant threat to both Ukrainian infantry and civilians in frontline cities. In Pokrovsk area, approximately 70% of Ukrainian casualties have been caused by drone strikes. So, the Ukrainian armed forces have introduced a new defensive concept in the Pokrovsk area, the drone line. The tactic involves establishing a 10-15 kilometers deep tactical zone where Russian forces will be unable to advance without sustaining losses, while Ukrainian infantry, supported by drones, can detect and destroy enemy units under continuous air cover. This is a promising solution given the realities of the war in Ukraine, or rather, Russia's manpower advantage. Drones may be able to tune the tide of the lack of manpower. Monitoring of the fighting in the Pokrovsk direction allows us to judge that the Russian army's offensive pace is slowing down. The number of combat engagements in the front line has been decreasing recently, 739 last week compared to 1,000 plus in previous weeks. This can be explained by the activity of Ukrainian drones, cold weather, and the lack of equipment of the Russian side. The number of Russian casualties in the Battle of Pokrovsk is close to the size of the Russian Western Military District as of 2022, which includes 3 armies, 1st Tank, 6th and 20th Combined Armed Armies. This military district has been prepared for a war with NATO. The 1st Tank Army is the largest tank army in the world. This is about 60% of the total forces with which Russia planned to capture Ukraine in 3 days in 2022. During the first few weeks of the offensive, Russian losses are estimated at 13,000 soldiers. In February 2024, Russian losses were estimated more than 50,000 soldiers killed and wounded. Russia's total losses in the 13 months of fighting in the Pokrovsk direction amount to about 150,000 soldiers killed and wounded. It's just only in Pokrovsk region. This is more than Russia's losses in the battle for Bakhmut, 100,000. Only visually confirmed losses of the Russian army for 13 months of fighting in the Pokrovsk district amount to 1,800 weapons. Real losses are even higher. Last question. Countering the full-scale Russian aggression in the air domain. Back in 2022, Russian army aviation lost its ability to operate over the territory of Ukraine. The losses incurred by Russian invasion have far exceeded the capacity of the Russian defense industry to produce new aircraft. Ukraine's airspace was closed. However, the challenge of countering both missiles and drones remains unresolved. Almost 2,000 missiles were launched by Russia at Ukraine in 2024. 56% were shot down. 147 missiles were launched by the occupiers at Ukraine in the first 6 weeks of 2025. At least 50 missiles were shot down or neutralized by electronic warfare. In 2024, Russian forces launched a total of 10,949 attack drones against Ukraine. Of these, 68% were interception by air defenses, while 26% were neutralized by electronic warfare. The highest number of drone attacks occurred in November 2024. In total, Russia has launched 3,856 attack drones since the beginning of 2025. Ukraine has Soviet-made fighters, American F-16s and French Mirage 270s. It is possible that other fighters from European partners will be added to these. The first Mirage 2000 aircraft from France are already in Ukraine. They can operate as air defense. The exact number of aircraft delivered is not yet known. 18th slide. Ukraine's defense industry is betting on future improving technology and scaling up production of drones and missiles. It is about strikes not only on the front line, but also throughout Russia. Particularly interesting new developments are presented on the slide. As conclusion, I would like to say that through the ongoing offensive and defensive operations, we see that smaller nations can resist the military pressure of a superior adversary with greater resources and firepower. Ukraine is not the first country to demonstrate the possibility of sustained resistance against a stronger opponent. However, Ukraine's situation differs significantly. Ukraine was attacked by a nuclear-armed state. Nevertheless, the fundamental principle of victory remains unchanged: innovation, new strategies, advanced technologies, continuous adaptation at the tactical and operational levels, national resilience, and support from allies. These are the key components of success for a smaller nation facing a military superior opponent. Good intentions must have fees. We know it 100%. Thank you for your support. Glory to Ukraine.
Thank you very much, Viacheslav. That was an excellent presentation. We are now moving on to Hanna Shelest. Hanna is the Director of Security Studies and Global Outreach Programs at the Foreign Policy Council Ukrainian PRISM and Editor-in-Chief at Ukraine Analytica. She is also a non-resident senior fellow at SIPA in Washington, D.C., and head of the supervisory board at the Ukrainian Institute. She has served for more than 10 years as a senior researcher at the National Institute for Strategic Studies under the President of Ukraine, Odessa branch. In 2014, she was a visiting research fellow at the NATO Defense College in Rome. She was an advisor of the working group preparing Ukrainian Navy Strategy 2035 and was involved in working groups developing the foreign policy strategy of Ukraine. Welcome, Hanna.
Good morning. Now from the land and air, we will move to the maritime domain that is unfortunately much less in the news. So in this case, that is quite interesting because that demonstrates how the news perform the perception of the war rather than very often the situation on the ground. Because when we've been dividing the front lines and when usually journalists are asking me, for example, okay, what is the situation on the ground, where on the front? And I said, which front do you mean? Because de facto we usually divide the front to the 5, sometimes even equal parts. That is definitely the north, that is closer to the Kursk, what Viacheslav just described to you, the Kharkiv region. Then we are speaking about the east, that's Pokrovsk, Bakhmut, and all those that you predominantly have in your news. Then we move to the south, and that's everything what's been happening around the Kherson region, around the Crimea as the land, and over there. Then we speak about the fourth domain, what I call the whole territory of Ukraine, because the Russian attacks are happening up to the Polish border. So you cannot say that those territories are not the front line when in some of the days you had a significant number of attacks. But at the same time, you always have the fifth domain, and that is the maritime domain of this warfare that's been active since the day one, so since 2014, and that's where de facto everything started. And one of the reasons of 2014, the desire of control of the maritime domain, and that's where Ukraine had the biggest successes at the battlefield. If we go to the asymmetric warfare and to how the countries can respond. I'm one of those persons who hate the PowerPoints because I remember the wonderful article, something like 15 years ago, saying that how we lost the war in Afghanistan because of the PowerPoint. And that was a serious military analysis about how many hours we are spending for preparation, and then de facto start thinking with the bullet points. However, understanding that not everybody are very much aware with the geography of the Black Sea, and because of the several things, it's better to show visually. That's why we will have just a few pictures over there, and that is definitely our parts of the Black Sea, just to keep your mind of understanding about what area we are going to speak about. And even if I would like to speak definitely about the latest developments, and that's where we have one of the biggest amount of the innovations that are coming almost monthly, so still we need to start with the very few historical moments, just to understand how everything been developed and why for us, together with the active measures happening in Donbass, the Black Sea always been one of the biggest threats and the fight for the Russian Federation. The reason is definitely Crimea, and here, even if we now skip all the historical, ideological, anything of this type, with my favorite phrase from the British Navy officer, a good friend of mine, who said, I never could understand why Russians are so fond of and think about Crimea as their glory places when both battles for Sevastopol they lost. One in 19th century in the Crimea War and another one at the Second World War. So Russia never won any battles for Crimea, if you go to the military history. However, that is the perfect creation of the military myths that are becoming, since the ancient Greeks, the big part of our military strategy, unfortunately. But why the Crimea is important from the military perspective? Because it is the seaports that never freeze. And that is definitely the possibility for the Russian forces to project their power, not only in the Black Sea, and here we need clearly understand when we try to analyze the Russian forces that have been stationing in Crimea and around, that when you read their maritime strategy, you clearly understand it is Black Sea Mediterranean. That was always their possibility to project their power to the Middle East and to the Mediterranean sea warfare or theater of warfare. And that was true even despite the limitation of the Montreal Convention that allowed the Turkey under the certain circumstances to close the straits. But up to 2022, that was a reality, and that's where it was important for them. When Ukraine announced that we are not going to prolong, that was long before 2014, that we are not going to prolong their stationing in Crimea. They've been discussing two possibilities, or three possibilities where to have their fleet. One is Novorossiysk, that's what you can see on the very from your side right of the map, the black flag, that is the port of Novorossiysk. Difficult in terms, like also non-freezing, but difficult winds for stationing. Another one is Syria, where they've been till recently, but at that time needed extreme amount of investments, and occupied territory of Georgia in Abkhazia, where they had quite a serious legal implications that till recently they were thinking should they do or not. They did it now, so now it is developing, and we see the different perception. However, when we speak about like the current situation, we need to divide into the two stages: the pre-war activities, and do we really had any possibilities of act there, and what's happened after 2022. So pre-war, the Russian Federation, when I said, no, it's better to say like this, it's pre-full-fledged war, that would be the correct phrase, because that's what I'm talking about, that's what's been happening from 2014 till 2022. So after occupation of Crimea, Ukraine lost 75% of its fleet and approximately 30% of their navy staff. Also, Ukraine de facto appeared without any coastal defense because that was the reality of perception of the Black Sea as the peaceful and underestimation of any threats, that most of our military equipment, navigation systems, except of the commercials, and the coastal guard, the aviation, that was all concentrated on the numerous bases in Crimea. Odessa port, that is on our left, de facto became the biggest commercial port. But the Navy base that I remember being as the child have been closed. Until 2014, you didn't have any Navy ships except of the sea breeze exercises coming in the nice white uniforms for the cocktails in the city, but there were no real stationing of the Navy in Odessa, especially when we speak about the ships. The same happened with Mykolaiv, with Kherson, with other big ports that had some remains of the infrastructure. Yes, they had the presence of the Marines, for example, because the Ukrainian Navy, we need to understand, we're speaking about the fleet, we are speaking about the Marines, and we are speaking about the sea aviation, marine aviation. But still, I would say that before 2014, we had 10% at other parts of Ukraine and 90% in Crimea in terms of the capabilities. That significantly changed because urgently we needed to move the forces, most of them being based in Odessa. That's necessity to create the architecture, but that was also the necessity to create the new strategy. You can imagine that covering such a huge amount of the cost and being the littoral state, Ukraine never had the Navy strategy till 2018. That was the first time when Navy received a separate understanding and tried to respond to a very important question: who we are, what are our difference from other forces, what are our goals, and what we can reach. And that was extremely important for Ukraine, and that's important for other maritime countries that are big, because most of the people at the general staff at that time, or by that time, they were people from the land or air forces. So they had, unfortunately, in terms of the threat perception, a very land-oriented, land-centered approach. And I remember drafting in 2015 the national security strategy. There were a lot of people in the capital who asked, do we really have the different type of the threats from the sea? It's the same threats that we have. The 2022 demonstrated that yes, we have, and yes, many countries, and that's, for example, including Qatar and many of the Middle Eastern countries, is important for them. Very often we underestimate what the sea means for us and what type of the actions we can do. In Ukrainian case, 70% of our export was going by sea. So try to imagine that you suddenly need to reorient 70% of your goods from the container, from the ships, to the lands. That's infrastructure, that's money, that's capabilities that you need, that all other things that are involved, and we experienced it, we are still experiencing despite opening of the ports for some of the goods. But if we go from this understanding, what in 2018 Ukraine realized when we've been brainstorming for 1 year the new Navy strategy, that we should stop thinking about maritime domain purely from the platform-oriented approach. Because if you look to all the documents, all analysis, before this, we always thought, okay, we need 5 ships or 7 ships. Most of the analysis before 2014 about the maritime power balance in the Black Sea, but not only there, that was the comparing of, do we have 3 frigates or 4 brigades? Do we have this type of the carrier, or do we have this one? That was one of the reasons why, for example, Russia wanted to bring Mistral to the Black Sea. That was a total nonsense from the military perspective, because it is like an elephant in the kids' pool in the hotel. Is it powerful? Yes, elephant is powerful. Can it do anything there, or is it any effective? Definitely not. Luckily, this Mistral moved instead of the Black Sea to Egypt. Don't know was it effective for Egypt or not, but at least it was the political decision. But that was the power projection much more than any other real capabilities that we needed for the fleet. Ukrainian Navy strategy looked from the capabilities approach, not from the platforms approach. And definitely we couldn't envisage a lot of the threats that came later, but when in the morning I reopened that document of 2018, I realized that our approach, de facto, was very right. Because we looked for the first 5 years that we needed to go to the just the coastal defense and reconnaissance, at least for the 12-mile zones. That's understandable. That's what Ukraine reached at the very few months of 2022. The second stage that originally was 2025, the idea was to project the power in the exclusive economic zone, so up to 200 miles. For you to understand, the Black Sea is really small, because from if you go from Odessa to Crimea, you would have approximately 400. So 200 is like already almost half. And here you go to the projection. That's what happened with the Neptune missiles, and that's where we go to the current warfare. The third stage, we dreamt by 2030 that we will go to the Blue Sea, so oceans helping our allies in other operations. We still have 4 years. Who knows, maybe by 2030 we again return to the blue waters. But 2 elements that I would like to describe about the pre-war that are important lessons for others, but what is already less actual for us. One is that before 2022, Russia did a lot of actions about the control of the sea, but not violating international law. So we even called it the lawfare in the maritime domain, because they always went between the, like, on the edge of violating. So you cannot even go properly to the Hamburg Tribunal, for example. So the one of the ideas, it was the war of exercises. You know that according to the international maritime law, if you have the Navy exercises, you need to close the certain areas for the navigation. And the UN clause are written in such a way that you can close wherever you want for any time, but it says for reasonable time. So we had this reasonable time, but sometimes Russia announced exercises for 6 months. That's definitely not the reasonable time for closing. Or they were closing up to, and I had few We'll return to back. For example, that was the closure zones in July 2019. All in red, that was Russia officially notified in Madrid, is the center responsible for the Black Sea, that these zones are closed for the navigation. You can imagine I don't know if it is visible from the area for this, or that was the closure of the zones for 2 overlapping exercises. Or that's, for example, the February 2022, just 2 weeks before the war. That's the zones Russia closed for the navigation, de facto in this way totally blocking Odessa port. So Odessa port was blocked 2 weeks before, with the reason is because from Odessa, the navigation line is going straight to Istanbul, and the shallow waters near the coast would not allow any of the ships to pass, not enough of the depths. So, have they violated any law? No, they said we have exercises. But de facto, they blockade the 3 commercial ports for 2 weeks before the war, even before starting everything else. So, with all these conditions, no fleet, closing of everything, blockade, what Ukraine did, and that would be going over there. So first of all, Ukraine needed to understand what capabilities we need. That's why I went that much in the history, so for you to understand that you started thinking of capabilities. So for this, we emphasize 2 things. Thing number 1 is the new type of the anti-ship missiles, and understanding how we can defend ourselves as much as possible, not only with the classical mining of the territories or waters around, that's not sufficient, but with the long-range missiles that can work in combinations with the reconnaissance drones. The first operations, like in April 2022, when immediately Russia lost the flagman of their Black Sea fleet, called Moscow, very symbolic for us. It's happened with the unique combination of the Turkish Bayraktar drones that been taking off attention, but at the same time really giving the perfect picture of what is happening, and the Neptune missiles, the anti-ship missiles that Ukraine just produced a few before this. But what was the real go-ahead? It is the maritime drones. And here is important to understand that the original, we would speak only about the 2, Magura and Sea Baby. And several things that I would emphasize before finishing this round, because we can go in many of the other details like spoofing or anything else. So the question number 1 is that Navy was not in charge of developing any of the maritime drones. The 2 agencies that developed 2 biggest maritime drones, Sea Baby was developed by the security services of Ukraine, so it is domestic security. And the Magura was developed by the military intelligence. It is a nonsense, and that demonstrated very important limits of the Ukrainian situation, that these agencies had much bigger budget than the Navy. But when the operation starts, not the development R&D stage, but implementations, these 2 agencies were unable to use them properly without involvement of the Navy. So when you see the first operations and the successful attacks against the Crimea, that was always that navigation part, targeting part, and all of these being done by the Navy. However, these big drones that started to be asymmetric weapon for Ukraine, like you don't have ships, you have big drones. What these drones been doing? Originally kamikaze drones, so using like a torpedo, but with the different technical characteristics. But then it was not enough, because Russians started to use helicopters. So you started to think about electronic warfare against them. So the second challenge was to create a unique multi-domain system of navigation and operations when you are not dependent just on the one channel of communication. So you have Starlink, you have other types, so you have everything and definitely automatization of the operation. But then the helicopters against you, so targeting you. And in January, we have the first case when the marine drone targeted 2 Russian helicopters that Russia lost. Why? It came with the idea in 2024 to start put the offensive weapons to the drones. That saved two tasks. Task number one is defense of the drones, because they were able to do the air defense, and they used in January the R-73 modernized type, because you can imagine targeting and launching from the very shaky surface is difficult. They managed to solve it. But the second one, these drones stopped to be kamikaze. They started to be the multi-use drones, what, considering the price, became an extremely important task. And the last, and it will be my last, it is for this multi-use, it is the new, what's happened since December. They managed to create a system when you can use the marine drones for the launch of the FPV drones. So in this case, your drone is coming closer to the enemy shore, and then a number of the FPV drones launching from there, what again needed a very important task, and then targeting the one of the aims at the shore. And the case that been proved already, it is on the 6th of January when the FPV drones from the sea drone targeted the air defense system Pantsir, one of the most sophisticated Russian systems, but this combination of the marine drones and aerial drones started from them, managed to target two of them and destroying it. So de facto, what I talked to you about the innovations in the drones, we would speak about the period of 1 year. I even not returned earlier because the first drone we started to use only 1 year after the initiate of the war. So 2 years of the war and total change of the asymmetric warfare and the new capabilities that appeared.
Thank you, Hanna, for that very enlightening presentation. And we will now move on to Henrik Praks. Henrik is a research fellow with the Security and Resilience Program at the International Center for Defense and Security Studies in Estonia. He holds master's degrees from Tartu University's Faculty of Law and East European Studies from Freie Universität Berlin. He is also a graduate of the International Training Course of the Geneva Center for Security Policy. In 2020, he was seconded by the Estonian Government Office as a senior analyst to the European Center of Excellence for Countering Hybrid Threats in Helsinki, where he served until coming back to the ICDS. Earlier in his career, he held various positions within the Estonian Ministry of Defense, focusing on defense and security policy, regional security, NATO, and the EU defense issues. He has lectured in strategic studies at the Baltic Defense College. Between 2015 and 2018, he was a member of the ICDS and director of the annual Baltic Conference on Defense. His area of expertise includes hybrid warfare, influence activities, Baltic Sea regional security, and comprehensive security. Thank you, Henrik.
Thank you, and let me jump in now between the Ukrainian presentations with a bit different perspective, although I try to tie it also to Ukrainian experiences or the lessons we try to draw from Ukrainian experience. I would first like to mention that today is the 107th anniversary of Estonian Republic, which was established in 1918. And of course, although there are the usual celebrations in Tallinn and other cities and places in Estonia, this day is now since 2022 marred or overshadowed by the fact that it is also, unfortunately, the anniversary of Russian aggression or full-scale aggression against Ukraine. I will be speaking, although my portfolio currently focuses more on hybrid and non-military issues, I will still be speaking about the Estonian defense or more defense military strategy, how Estonia builds up its defense system, and also I will conclude by drawing some lessons Estonia has taken from the Ukrainian experience and in adaptation of its forces. In our case, it is very clear we have only one potential adversary. All our other neighbors are our close friends and allies. Potential adversary is obviously Russia. We are incomparable to the size to Russia. Estonia is less than 1% of the Russian population. We are 1.3 million people in Estonia, and territory-wise, Estonia is, I calculated, 380 times smaller, so incomparable in any measurement. So for a successful defense and deterrence strategy, we obviously need allies, and also our history tells us that we need allies, because after being independent between two world wars, we lost the independence in 1940 because there was also no allies at that time. In 91, when we re-established independence, since that, the guiding principle of Estonian security policy has always been so-called never again alone principle. So in 2004, we managed to use this window of opportunities with our Baltic neighbors to join NATO, and it seemed to be that this NATO accession solved the security and defense dilemma. But already 2008, Russia's war with Georgia, 2014, obviously, Crimea annexation, the start of the war in East Ukraine showed that Russian aggressiveness has not disappeared. Still, politicians used to say in those times that Estonia has never been as secure in history as before. But now, 2022 Russian attack on Ukraine shaked totally those conventional perceptions. And it is clear that never since regaining independence, there has not been such a high threat to Estonian national security. So Estonian national defense is built up on two pillars. As a member of NATO, obviously one is the collective defense, the Article 5 guarantee of a NATO alliance, but the second pillar is national defense capabilities. I will leave the NATO aspect aside because it's a topic for another preparation, and concentrate on the national side, because national efforts, because the conference here is speaking about small states, what are the small states doing. But let me just mention that in the context of NATO, we have in Estonia currently around 2,000 troops from three NATO nuclear powers, the biggest contingent from the UK, which is the leading nation in the forward land forces, or formerly known as enhanced forward presence. We have also 600 US troops under a separate arrangement in Estonia, and several hundred French troops. There are also capabilities because being a member of NATO, which Estonia as a country with a small size and limited resources is not going to invest, for example, air combat capabilities. You may know since already from the beginning of a NATO membership, the Baltic countries have been covered by NATO air policing mission, and there are other high-end capabilities which we would not develop. But now on Estonia's own efforts, it was mentioned yesterday also that a small state with limited resources can only build up credible defense capabilities through the use of reserve forces, which are, as a rule, developed by the utilization of a conscript principle. And Estonia was one of a few countries in Europe which never abandoned in those post-Cold War peace dividend environment, never abandoned the principle of conscription. I think the influence of our northern neighbors, Finland, which has been always strong on conscription, was a decisive factor that we didn't take that road. So we have a conscription for a male population of 8 to 11 months, and it is also voluntary for women. So the reserve force is built up through that conscription. But after the latest increases in 2023, the Estonian wartime structure will consist of 44,000 personnel, which is over 3% of the whole population. And only bit more than 4,000 of this personnel are the regular professional militaries. So 90% of the force will come from the civilian life, from the reserve. And I will return to this reserve issue in a minute. The forces are land forces centric, obviously Estonian division, which includes 2 maneuver brigades, and also a British brigade which will be deployed to Estonia in case of a crisis, will be integral part of that. The air and naval capabilities are more specialized. Now, returning to this reserve issue, functional deterrence can only be guaranteed by actual existing capabilities. And in case of a reserve forces, or actually in case of every forces, the readiness is a central theme. And there is a clear understanding in Estonia that with a national defense system like we have, there is a need to achieve in case of crisis or a situation of war, combat readiness in a matter of hours, basically, not days. So the Estonian plans are built up that a large part of this reserve force would be covered within 48 hours. So how should we achieve that? Where, of course, the personnel in reserve would have to be is trained. They are trained as individuals, also as a units. They are organized as a units, not as a kind of a general pool of reserve manpower from which you will start to build up units. They know their war tasks. I mean, the commanders, at least maybe not the personnel itself, but the commanders of subunits and units know which region they are going to operate, which task they would have to fulfill according to various operational plans. And obviously a key component is the keeping up the professional skills of a reserve personnel. Principle what we are not going to, should not let Russians to take any parts of a territory. It's no secret, it's been discussed in open source that NATO planning was before the Ukrainian war, that territory may be lost and then recovered. I mean, as a kind of as the forces arrive, so giving away own land to gain time for organization of a counterattack. But after Ukrainian experiences, I mean, the difficulty of getting land back, but more importantly, even the atrocities which Russia actually has been conducting on occupied territory, it's not a feasible option. So now the emphasis of the whole NATO planning and also national planning has moved from passive defense to active defense when you have to defend from the first meter. A related issue is a need for long-range fires to be able to influence potential adversary deep into their territory to prevent even greater damage on our own territory. For example, Estonia has procured HIMARS systems, also ATACMS missiles not yet arrived, but and some other weapon systems for independent or national long strike capabilities, and also will be looking at maybe innovative solutions like Ukraine has been using so successfully drones, long-range drones. Third issue I would mention is a need for ammunition, even if conflict is shorter. I mean, the amounts of ammunition or firepower used in Ukraine have really been enormous. So, and also war has clearly shown that there is how empty actually are the ammunition stores in Europe. So during the last 2 years, Estonia has procured more ammunition of various calibers than during the preceding 30 years together. And we have allocated more than 1.6 billion for a number of years for just for ammunition procurement. And as far as I know, or has been told, obviously the data is not public, but Estonia has been among the top procurers of ammunition in the whole Europe, which obviously shows a lot of about Estonia's effort, but also shows how actually little many still a majority of European countries are doing in this changed situation. Fourth, I will mention also a new principle adopted in the case of procurement. Before it was, let's say, two key categories. One, the main key category was the price. That lowest price or lower price had the advantage, and obviously also some, let's say, country of origin considerations of we never did direct political procurement from a specific country, but you had to diversify between the European and Americans and etc. Now a third category has come into play. Very importantly is the speed of delivery. For example, Estonia in late 23 procured a few hundred APCs from Turkey, which raised some eyebrows about also among some of our allies, because in Europe there are a lot of producers of APCs, similar APCs, but they were either probably more expensive, but most importantly, their delivery times were many times longer, would have been, than the ones we are already getting now. We are arriving in Estonia from Turkey. And yeah, I'm just finishing. And also, we are purchasing systems which have been effective in Ukraine, like IRIS-T and CSAR, self-propelled howitzers. So in some, Estonian defense as a member of NATO is foreseen, obviously, as a collective defense operation, but there is a clear recognition that we have to do our part, and also especially in the initial stages, the national efforts would play a key role before the alliance or our individual allies would come to our assistance in a more forceful way. So we need to convince the adversary that we will fight back and fight hard. So to show, so Estonian defense needs first the will to defend, second trained people. The system, how those people would be very quickly put to the field as units, efficient armaments, and necessary supplies of ammunition and all the other supplies. So that's a very quick snapshot of the main principles of Estonian defense build-up.
Thank you, Henrik. We have our last panelist today who's going to be zooming in, I believe. Is that right? Okay. Oleksandr Bogomolov. Professor of Arab linguistics, he received his PhD in Arabic dialectology from the Institute of Oriental Studies in Moscow in 1992. He has been a director of the National Institute for Strategic Studies, a Ukrainian government-affiliated think tank. He was previously director of the A. Krimsky Institute of Oriental Studies. He has worked as a consultant with the UNDP, UNHCR, and OSCE for Crimea-related projects, refugee issues, and project evaluation. His research interests include Arab and Ukrainian political discourse, Middle Eastern politics, conflict studies, Muslim communities in Ukraine, Russian soft power, and post-Soviet identity politics. His most recent paper, as a project initiator, editor, and co-author, is Strategic Impact of Russian Aggression on Ukraine and the Road to Peace, published in September 2023. His most recent book is Names of the Revolution, Discourse of the Arab Spring. Thank you, Oleksandr.
Hello, yeah, thanks so much for inviting me. I was asked by Professor Ashur to speak in Arabic. If you don't mind, I will switch to Arabic. تحية طيبة من العاصمة الأوكرانية المحاربة.
So I'm going to attempt to speak in Arabic, despite the fact that I haven't spoken for a long period of time in Arabic. So that is why I do apologize if there are any mistakes or difficulty clarifying what I would like to say in my intervention. I'm going to intervene in Arabic, and also my presentation is going to appear before you now. So do you see my presentation? Do you see my presentation on the screen? إذن كما ترون عرضي هو باللغة الإنجليزية. So this is my presentation. It is in English. As you can see before you, I'm going to talk about the topic as much as I can. I'm going to intervene in Arabic. So 3 years have elapsed since the direct aggression of Russia on Ukraine had started. And I would like to remind you about the different phases of this war during the last 3 years. So there are 3 phases, 3 modes of war. So we had all-out defense, relying mostly on the national pre-war resources, first and foremost. And consequently, as a result of that, we were able to move to a counter-offensive. And this took place between March, autumn 2022. And this has led to the liberation of a number of areas in the eastern and northern part of Ukraine. And after that, after the counter-offensive operation that started in 2002 until 2003, and it was not as successful in areas, particularly in certain eastern areas, Kharkiv, for instance. And after that, we gradually moved to a different mode of war. So we moved to the war of attrition phase. So we're still in this particular phase, which is the phase of attrition. So very briefly, I would like to talk about the different principles of war. So there are talks about this war, which is similar to previous wars, old wars. This is on the one hand, and there are also some pivotal and radical changes that have happened in the war undertaken due to the technologies that are being used. And when we talk about the principles of war, we have, for instance, ethics of war. So the morale. So we talk about the principles such as the morale. So morale to physical as 3 to 1. This is the Napoleon excerpt, and also we have the counter-attack that happened in Kharkiv, and also the entry into the Koska region in 2024. So the elements of surprise played a very important role in these two maneuvers that have taken place. So currently, and since 2024, we are living in a new reality. So this new reality that includes a kind of slow attrition mode. So we have the traditional forms of warfare that gradually exhausted their effectiveness. So we're talking about the effectiveness of both sides of the war, the two warring factions or parties. And that is why any progress can only happen if we have an increase in number or mobilization or techniques that are used. So we need to have either higher numbers or new techniques and revolutionary technologies. So for the success of this technique, we can give you an example about Ukraine's success in maritime drone campaign against the Russian Black Sea Fleet. So the Ukrainian forces were able to fight in those areas, particularly the western areas of the Black Sea. So that is why this is strategically very important indeed, because this is a very important area when it comes to Ukraine merchandise and exports. And it is also very important for the economy of Ukraine. So when it comes to the ground battlefield, we were able in this race, technological race, we have reached a level of saturation where we have had a number of drones and missile strikes, and the battlefield was kind of transparent, whereby it is very impossible to have the previous modes of war. And as a result of that, it is very difficult to mobilize large units, as it was the case at the beginning of the war, and to have large-scale maneuvers and exercises. So we have had units that participated in these attacks, and these are very small units with limited number of personnel. And at the same time, we have had company size, and also we have had the use of drones, as we can see in recent days. These are attacks that carried out by the Russians, who use missiles in their attacks, particularly ballistic missiles, the most dangerous kind of such kind of missiles. Also, we have seen increase in attacks on oil refineries and the different defense facilities in different parts of Russia. So during these attacks, we benefit, of course, from the usage of different drones. And it is also mentioning that we have entered into the attrition phase, so where we have an attrition tempo. And this is a kind of a race of all resources, including human resources, economic resources, ammunition, and the most important resource is time. So this is a war of attrition on these kind of resources. So it is worth noting that there are certain events that show the pace and the attrition and the impact on both sides. The Russian army has subdued roughly 41 to 48% of its total casualties in Ukraine between 2022 until 2024 alone. So human resources suffered a great deal in the Russian military. So the second observation that I would like to underline, and that is very important when it comes to the assessment of the Russian military, whether they advance or lack of advancement in the different phases of the war. During the first phase of the invasion, when the northern areas were liberated, and here I'm talking about the first counter-offensive, 19.6 of Ukrainian territories were under Russian occupation, and now we're talking about 19.2%. And of course, we listen to the Russian propaganda in different languages where they try to talk about the Russian military advancing in Ukraine. But as you can see in this percentage, that this does not apply to the reality on the ground compared to the beginning of the invasion. When it comes to loss of personnel, so at the beginning they lost 20,000, and the number is in excess of 800,000. And when we talk about military equipment, they have lost 7,300 tanks. They are lost, and only 500 of those tanks can be reconditioned, because we're talking about old military equipment from the side of the Russians, dating back to the Second World War and the Cold War. When it comes to the defense industrial base, when it comes to the Ukrainian capacity, Ukraine now and last year produced 1/3 of its weapons, compared to less than 10% during the start of the war. So we have listened to the news yesterday, and they said that as per this current year's plan, they aim to cover the needs of this year. So when it comes to drones, 96 there have been 96 drones that have been used last year. So the table that you can see before you, this slide is from The Economist. As you can see before you, we can see how the Russians have advanced during the different phases of the war. So it shows that there is a kind of a stable line. So these are the regions that are under Russian control in the eastern and southern parts. So what is very important in this war, and that is very difficult to understand because so many do not understand the lives of people in Ukraine and their culture, it is very important for the CSOs to take part in such kind of endeavor. We're talking about all non-military institutions to take part in this war. So there is a quotation very much known that armies don't fight wars, countries fight wars. So it is not the armies that fight, but it is countries that fight wars. And this is the reality that we all know. We know it very, very well. There are many things that the community can take part in this strive for the independence of Ukraine. So the most important role is played by businessmen. We're talking about important businessmen, small, medium-sized businesses working in technology, working in IT, for instance. These are very important businesses. Most of these companies have started working in the making of robotics, of drones, and also they started working on cyber defense. And there is also another role that can be played and is played with the communications and transportation sector, particularly when it comes to the banking system, which is very important to guarantee the integrity of banking network and also to facilitate transfers of money. And also the CSO, they concentrate on raising funds in order to help the homeless, the needy, and so on. So CSOs, the civil society organizations, volunteers, they played and they still do play a very important role in supporting and propping up the defense of Ukraine. And here I would like to give you some figures. The total amount that was آسفة لمقاطعتك، بقي لديك فقط 5 دقائق. شكرا. So despite the fact that the war is still taking place, we have CSOs, organizations, they continue supporting the defense of Ukraine. And we have seen an increase, 1.4 more than 2023. Also, it is very important for us to understand, of course, due to the time constraint, I cannot give all the details mentioned in this particular slide. That is why I'm going to take a few snippets and shine light on them. So when we talk about traditional land domains such as sea, air, land, there is a new kind of domain, which is the cognitive domain, which plays an increasingly important role in this war. Here we are facing a lot of difficulties because this is a war of reflections, such as external perspective removed from the battlefield and culturally blind. So that is why we would like people to understand the nature of war and the goals behind this war. Russia exerted a lot of efforts in order to hide its imperialistic, expansionistic ambitions. So these are the aims and objectives that they try to achieve. And it is not the role played by NATO the reason behind this aggression. So that is why it is incumbent on us to understand these aims and objectives. So these components are very important, and we take into account, of course, the advent of the new American administration. So the other point that I would like to underline here. The previous or the current strategies have seen so many changes and transformations with regard to support of Ukraine, and this emanates from the concept of self-restraint. This is a concept that underlines the importance of not responding to Russian provocations, and this is also very important. So we have to restrain ourselves in order to impede any advancement and not to respond to the provocations by the Russians. And of course, not to resort to using certain kinds of weapons and also the arrival of certain kinds of weapons during previous phases of the war. So where are we now after all of these? So we're still in the attrition phase. From a military perspective, it is not as it is delineated by so many. So parts of the operations are mental, cognitive, so that is why we have to take that into account for any success in the battlefield. So that is why the cognitive or the mental component is very important. So the Ukrainian military was able to show a great deal of resoluteness in fighting attempts made by the Russians in their attempts to advance forward. Their advancement was very limited. So that is why this is what is called integrated deterrence. We're talking about huge loss subdued by the Russians. At some points, they lost 2,000 fighters in one day. And there are a number of indicators that show that the Ukrainian army has enough capabilities to stop any advancement. So what is going to happen afterwards? So here, whether we talk about military operations or the outcomes of the talks taking place these days, so perhaps the outcomes would be successful or perhaps not successful. Irrespective of the situation remains as it was throughout the last 3 years. So any decisive results would not happen diplomatically, but would happen on the ground. But for now, the situation is as it is, or as it was. So what is the future vision? Irrespective of the names given to these phases, we have to continue as we have started, and we have Oleksandr, آسفة للمقاطعة, because we would like to make sure that the Russians would not have the opportunity to be decisive with the outcomes of the war, and then we have to try to gather all the components that I talked about, civil and military components, and try to build an integrated deterrence system. This is a deterrence by denial system. So we have to remain resolute. We have to keep on cooperating with Western powers and international powers that support us, and in order to put an end to the threat present or presented by the Russians, and that is not going to disappear in the coming 10 to 15 years. There are indicators that show that. آسفة على المقاطعة سيد ألكسندر، أشكرك جزيلا.
Sorry, we're going to have to end here. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that very enlightening presentation as well. We are over time a bit, but we did start late, so I'm hoping we still have about 10 minutes for Q&A. Okay. So before I open it up to the audience, as the chair, I wanted to start off with one question. With one insight and question I have for you, which is Ukraine has, and Estonia as well, because of Ukraine's example, have really made remarkable progress and, been able to prevent the Russian incursion from in this war of attrition because of the revolutionary technologies that they've really invested into, both on land and maritime operations. However, as I'm sure we're all aware of the news with Trump's very undermining attempt in his approach to Ukraine and his refusal to admit just how remarkable and how much capability Ukraine has in defeating Russia still. What is the worst case scenario for Ukraine should Trump do the unthinkable and really pull all sort of financial and military support for Ukraine if they choose to go in that direction, which might be quite plausible? So before you answer that, I'll give you time to think about it. I'd like to have us ask 3 or 4 questions from the audience, and then everybody can answer those questions at once. So Omar, would you like to go first with your question? Yeah. We can give the microphone to Omar.
Thank you so much for the fascinating panel. Really great papers. And Alex, I don't know what you're talking about. Your Arabic is better than mine. I don't know if you're still with us. So I have, this is a generic question. Probably Viacheslav or Hanna can pick, or Alex can pick up on it. And to follow on what you just said, Christina. So there has been consistent attempt to bridge two eras of warfare, industrial and information, and two systems of warfare, Soviet, Ukrainian, and Western. And it's very clear from the images of the Sukhoi 24 carrying a Storm Shadow, British-French cruise missile, air-launched, with a Soviet-era airplane older than me. So in your assessment, how effective is this? This applies also to air defense, so you have the Frankenstein systems, also blending Soviet with Western munitions. And what you've really mentioned, Hanna, about the consistent innovations in unmanned systems, unmanned surface systems. And now they're performing air defense tasks, dropping attack helicopters that is trying to attack them, but also launching munitions as well, semi-autonomous munition, let's call it this way. So how do you assess the impact in terms of effectiveness? And then just a very brief comment on the figures. This is the figures are just staggering by any scale. This is it's not World War II figures, but quite close, beyond anything that Europe has seen, whether in the Balkans or Chechnya, or beyond anything, even some of the Middle Eastern big wars, October 73 and onwards. It goes to a different level. I don't know any other country in Europe and perhaps even in Asia that can withstand 1,500 casualties. We're talking here casualties, just to clarify, and 800,000. This is dead, wounded, POWs, missing and defected. So all the 5 categories, not just dead. But take 1,500 and keep going on the offensive. They're not even defending a territory, they are on the offensive. And this is probably have some implications for attrition. And also if you can comment on how long can this be sustained.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you. Can we have some other questions as well? Yes, I think we can.
Good morning. Bob Hamilton from the Foreign Policy Research Institute in the U.S. Thank you all for what was a really, really informative and fascinating panel. I guess a 2-part question. The first is, so Viacheslav and Oleksandr, you both sort of implied or stated the fact that offensive maneuver in this war has become really difficult due to the combination of prepared defensive lines, persistent surveillance, and precision strike capability. Study of the history of warfare suggests that's not a permanent state of affairs. Something will break that, right? The defensive is the dominant form of warfare now in Ukraine. Attrition is part of that. Some combination of tactics and technology will probably at some point change the balance and make offensive maneuver more more probable or possible. So I wanted to ask if any of you had thoughts on what that might be, what might break the defensive stalemate. And the second piece is I wanted to ask about the personnel issue you hear very often on the Ukrainian side, the fact that Ukraine is able to mobilize somewhere around, I'm hearing around 30,000 people a month, but they're losing half of those to AWOLs or defectors. And so is there a plan in place over the long term to sustain the number of people you mobilize? Thank you.
Well, thank you for this wonderful panel. We've heard a lot about data, missiles, people killed, etc. But what is the impact on the people on the ground who basically crossed the border to other European countries, especially Ukrainian refugees in the United Kingdom? We're talking about hundreds of thousands. Can you give us some insights about the overall picture of Ukrainian refugees? We have been talking about Gaza recent, but now I think it's very, very interesting to understand the European Union countries' policies toward Ukrainian refugees, because there was no unified stance toward NATO, for example, but there has been a consensus about refugees crossing to the UK and other countries. Thank you.
Thank you. I think those are a good set of questions to begin with. So would any of you like to begin to start?
Let me start going there. I will start from the last question because it is the easiest. Partially, European Union has the unified position. They continued till the end of the next year the special refugee status for Ukrainians. It is the differences in terms of the conditions in each of the country. I mean, you receive $300 or $500 house or work or wherever, but we witness another problem that many countries liked Ukrainian refugees that much that they created the conditions for them to stay and to receive in simplified way the documents, because they bring income, they are well educated, they are with the no criminal records or any problems, and they are paying in some countries more taxes than what these countries spent for Ukraine. That's, for example, the Polish numbers of the last year. So under these conditions, now we have the problem that these countries would like to keep these refugees, not bring them back to Ukraine. But definitely, as any refugees, it doesn't mean that it is the ideal story or something, and it is the huge tragedy for the Ukrainian society with 4 million people out. But here, that would deserve a special session. I would not go in the more details here, just to understand that probably the case of Ukrainian refugees is not that classical case of others, because it is the different type of the refugees that moved, and also because it is divided families. We are speaking in 90% about females with the kids. So we are not speaking about the young men, for example, running because they cannot get the job, or the whole families. That's why that brings additional difficulties for the integration, and hope for the return as soon as it is. But if you have where to return, if you're from Bakhmut, you don't have where to return. So that's also the question of reconstruction that would heavily involve. But returning back to the military questions that we have here. First of all, it seems to me that this combination of the Soviet and Western, that was more of the necessity and the readiness to the asymmetric responses, because the initial response would be, no, we can't. Let's just find what is left in African or Asian countries from the old Soviet. But that would be the easiest and the most difficult response. So we needed to find the third way. And here, a lot dependent on the perception of the countries and readiness of the countries for integration, not only Ukrainian engineers. And let's not forget that before 2010, if I'm not mistaken, Ukraine was in the 10 biggest exporters of weapons. So despite the huge underfinancing of our military industry complex, but we still had engineers, we had a lot of the developments that were just not implemented in production. So we were not starting from the scratch in all these developments. But one of the examples is with the Storm Shadow and with these type of the missiles. Originally it was said that they cannot be input to the Soviet aircrafts. The French said, give us a little bit of time. Yes, it cannot be done automatically, but it can be integrated. It took them, if I'm not mistaken, 6 weeks. They found a solution. Not totally automatic as it is at the French Mirage, but it works, and it works efficiently. Germans said, no way. French said, but we did it. Yours very similar in this. We can integrate, we can help. Germans made a political decision, no Taurus. But explanation was not political, but it's technically impossible to do. We are waiting for the other type of the aircraft. So very often, that was the mix of the necessity, the available engineer decisions, and just available ammunition that we can use. But about the innovation effectiveness and what came from this, because when we speak about the innovations, it is both totally new technologies like marine drones and these innovations of integration. I would say that, as for now, integration was very successful, because you can use more and more in this equipment zoo, as we call it. That's really, the zoo operates quite well when it is possible. But the second issue is, just if I make the example with this, only with maritime drones, without Navy, Ukraine destroyed already 30% of the Russian Navy in the Black Sea. 28 Navy ships, plus 1 submarine. And it is the first case when submarine being targeted by the missile, not by the torpedo or something anti-ship. So with the regular missile that just shoots like surface to surface. That's these necessities that drives your creativity, but this creativity cannot be put on the like nothing. It should be a very strong R&D complex in the country that is prepared for this push in case they suddenly receive task, resources, and for the effectiveness, and that is my last phrase, the real-time testing. Because the problem with most of the innovations of the last years that they've been tested only at the ideal vacuum conditions somewhere at the testing ground. And that's happened, for example, with one of the US drones in the beginning of the war. They were extreme. I would not, like, not to do a bad marketing, they improved after this, but they've been super proud. I remember how in Washington they said, we're giving to you, nobody still use it. It is the new innovation, super, everything is fantastic. They appeared at the battlefield, immediately proved totally ineffective against the Russian counteroffensive and in the conditions of the real war. And in 1 month, we stopped buying them. And it took the producer quite time to reinvent them and to think differently. So that's why these real-time testing and the very quick, agile response from the soldiers, this works, that doesn't work, that is the only way how to make something effective.
2 quick points. First, on innovation, I think it's very hard, really, for outsiders to really grasp the innovation in drone warfare, especially, which is happening on the battlefield basically on a weekly or at least monthly basis, and also electronic warfare side. Just one example, I mean, there are Estonian volunteers, obviously, among the international volunteers fighting for Ukraine, both. And they have told both former conscripts and former officers that the traditional classical military training they have received from Estonia is very good and excellent for that battlefield. But we are not trained in a situation where there are small drones constantly in the air, not only surveying you, but also attacking you. And that's something I think all the other militaries basically are also not prepared yet. The second, the Trump question, I really hope that even in case when the US will pull the support from Ukraine, which hasn't happened but certainly is an option, the European allies could pull together and increase their support for Ukraine, because of course some of the US capabilities or the capabilities provided by the US are very hard to replace, but actually Europe has the resources, if we speak about financial and resources, really, if the big nations and Europe as a whole will take we'll make this a real number one priority to support Ukraine also without such a US support. And Estonia certainly is, as I know, willing and working with our allies to continue that.
Most of our ammunition were old, so we started our reinforcement in the war. So without any support from our partners, it was impossible supplying the modern weapons I give you some examples. For example, anti-aircraft system such as Patriot and NASAMS. Russia said that it was impossible to shut down their missiles, especially rocket ballistic missiles, but the number is 56% of missiles was shut down. About the drones, approximately 60% was shut down, and approximately 36% was neutralized by electronic warfare. So this is a modern technologies. They use modern technologies in anti-aircraft system. But we have other example from the land forces. For example, ammunition which supplied by the West was from the previous century. But if we compare in the battlefield the effectiveness with the Russian modern equipment and ammunition, this Western equipment and ammunition have the preferences. But I would like to notice that and repeat that only new technologies remains to use a victory. So new technologies, new equipment, only this, no a lot of amount, especially for small states, for small countries. Only this, the way for our victory. Thank you.
Thank you. Oleksandr, would you like to add anything?
Oh, yes, surely. Just a little bit, maybe. Yeah. Speaking about what happens, in the worst case scenario, somehow everyone is avoiding that, as far as I see. Clearly, no one really wants to think about it, but there are certain moments going on, and I have the sense from the last press conference, yesterday's press conference by the president, by the Ukrainian president, that there is, of course, an awareness, and an awareness means that the awareness is translated somehow into action. Of course, the European Union, I always believe that one of the main problem with the European Union and with Ukraine's European integration is that it's so big. There are so many voices and so many different positions inside. And we know that there is something like what you call the distance decay happening, inside this entity. This, I guess, a physical term, distance decay. In Arabic, it's al-mahlal al-masafa. It's like the further you go, the less signal you receive. And the signal is the Russian aggression. The signal is the Russian threat. And I'm absolutely sure that the neighboring countries, most, even including Hungary, but in its own way, the reaction of Hungary and their policies is just a negative response, but still to the same signal. They all receive the signal, but particularly and actively, the Nordic countries, Poland, the Baltic countries, there is some writing about that, although these are not official papers, but about making up something like a sub-alliance, not in contradiction to NATO principles or NATO, but something, some format for a more active cooperation. For Ukraine, these areas, the Central Europe in general, has become a strategic depth. Whatever our status, Article 5 or not Article 5, the country has changed dramatically. We now reoriented the society, everything, the economic assets, everything is reoriented from east to west. It used to be west to east, and now it's east to west. All the most important things are happening towards the west, and our western borders are very very, very important for more than ever in the history of the last decades. So there is something going on. There is a political communication. There is also, despite this distance, which was very palpable between us and the Western members, the old Europe, so to say. Now there is a far better understanding and hopes for the German position. We know that always was the British position, steadfast. And now, if we look at what's going on the front lines, it's really an attrition to Russia, Russian army and Russian economy to a large extent. On the other hand, we know this talking about whether or not someone could or could not, or whether these troops would be sufficient if they operate as peacekeepers. We're not, everyone is talking, by the way, incidentally, about peacekeepers, but it should, the discussion should be more about peace enforcers, and peace enforcement, not peacekeeping operation, in fact, but whether or not it's sufficient, In this situation, every drop is sufficient. Altogether, the combination may be achieved. Because Russia's despite all their official propaganda, their resources are being depleted, and very quickly so. The economy is in shatters. The financial system is almost collapsing. Their limits, they're living out of their limits. The only hope is for something like the negotiations that are, to their luck, are going on right now between them and the current American administration. But whether or not the current American administration, which seems to be not on the right page in this whole process right now, whether or not they will be willing to face a no from Ukraine. And Ukraine just has to say no if something goes the way it goes. This country is not surrendering, this is for sure. Not in a situation where we have steadfastly and successfully defended our position and continue to do so, and absolutely sure that despite all difficulties, including the one mentioned by some of the in some of the questions with the mobilization, we still have a lot of resources to fight, and we still have the will. And this is an existential fight. The morale is high anyway, and now it's higher. Even there are observations by many, I guess they are very much reliable, so it seems, from my personal communications as well, that the new challenge which is going, which we faced with on the diplomatic front, so to say, or I would say rather on the cognitive front, as I said in my presentation, it is really it's a debate about the reflection about war as opposed to war itself. If this goes the wrong way, no one is going to surrender, because this is not how external parties suffering from the distance decay, quite obviously, they just are not engaged, and they do not know the culture, they do not know the root causes, the real causes, as opposed to what the Russian president says of this war. They don't understand that this is a war of annihilation of Ukrainian nation, and Ukrainian nation is not there to be annihilated, this for sure. And this fight will continue. It will continue by all means, and it will, the manner in which it will continue, maybe missing some components or whatever, it will still be sufficient to knock off the enemy, with luck, of course, because of the fog of war and various unpredicted factors, that usually are the case on the battlefield. But anyway, that's the way to go, and that's how it will go, by all means, by all means.
Thank you, Oleksandr. And I think we've concluded our panel. If anybody has other questions, please feel free to come up to the panelists. But I'd like to thank all of our panelists and Oleksandr for your final hopeful and inspiring note. I would just like to say thank you, everyone, and Slava Ukraini.